The candles had burned low by the time the Beaumont family raised their glasses for the evening toast. 12 faces caught in the amber glow of a chandelier imported from Paris at considerable expense. The wine was Bordeaux, deep and red as a wound, and the smell of roasted lamb mingled with jasmine drifting through the open windows of the Louisiana countryside. It was June of 1859, and the air sat heavy on the skin like a warm wet cloth. Nobody at that table noticed the woman standing in the doorway between the kitchen and the dining room. Nobody noticed her at all. That was the point. Her name was Josephine, and she had been invisible for 13 years. She stood with her hands folded over her apron, watching the Beaumont family settle into their celebration with the easy comfort of people who had never once feared the food in front of them. The patriarch, Colonel Edward Beaumont, was turning 65 that evening. His wife, Celeste, sat at the opposite end of the long mahogany table, directing conversation the way a conductor directs an orchestra, with small precise gestures and a smile that never quite reached her eyes. Their 3 sons had returned from New Orleans and Baton Rouge with their wives. Grandchildren ran between the legs of furniture until their mothers silenced them with sharp whispers. The Beaumont estate covered nearly 4,000 acres of sugarcane outside the town of Thibodaux, and the colonel presided over it with the absolute certainty of a man who had never once been told. No. Josephine had been purchased at a market in Natchez 11 years earlier. She had arrived on a rainy Tuesday morning in iron shackles, her 2 sons standing beside her, one 8 years old and one 10. By Wednesday, the boys were gone. The estate's previous cook had recommended Josephine based on the meals she'd produced for a planter family in Natchez, and so the colonel had bought her and her alone, reselling the children that same afternoon to a cotton operation 40 miles east, toward the Mississippi border. Josephine had begged, she had wept until her throat was raw. Celeste Beaumont had watched this with an expression of faint distaste before turning back to her embroidery. The lamb that evening had been seasoned with rosemary and black pepper and something else, something that left no smell, no visible trace, nothing to warn a person whose tongue had been taught only to expect pleasure from Josephine's kitchen. She had been acquiring the substance for 4 months, a little at a time, from the hardware supply kept on the estate grounds. The overseer's store contained rat poison in large quantities, and an enslaved woman requesting it produced no particular alarm. The vermin in the cane fields were a constant problem. Nobody counted the exact ounces. Josephine had been precise in her calculations. She had listened during the years when the estate's physician, Dr. Armand Tureau, came to treat the family. She had stood behind screens and half-open doors, carrying trays and folding linens, learning the vocabulary of death, disguised as medicine. She had tested her understanding on animals, first, quietly, carefully, adjusting amounts with the patience of someone who had no reason to rush because she had nowhere to go and nothing left to protect. From the diary of Josephine, recovered decades later, its pages stained with kitchen smoke and river water. I have been a ghost in this house for 11 years. I have cooked their celebrations and their christenings. I have salted their grief and sweetened their pride. They call me by one name and think that is the whole of me. Tonight I will remind them that a person with nothing left to lose is the most dangerous person in any room. The grandchildren noticed something first, the way children always do before adults have assembled their denial. The youngest, a boy of 7 named Henry, pushed his plate aside and said the meat tasted different, like pennies on his tongue. His mother told him to stop being dramatic. The colonel raised his glass and made a toast to the land, to the family, to what he called the natural order of prosperity, and everyone drank. By 8 o'clock the first of them began to feel it. Colonel Beaumont's hands went still on the table. He looked down at them as if they belonged to someone else. His eldest son Louis tried to stand and found his legs answering only partially, like a marionette with cut strings. Celeste Beaumont pressed her napkin to her mouth and looked toward the kitchen doorway, but Josephine was already gone. She had walked out through the back of the kitchen, across the vegetable garden she had tended for 11 years, past the small well where she had drawn water in every season of her captivity, and into the tree line that bordered the property to the south. The dining room became chaos slowly. Then, all at once, chairs overturned, someone knocked the candelabra. One of the daughters-in-law crawled toward the entrance hall, calling for help in a voice that had lost its shape. From the quarters 200 yards away, the enslaved community heard the sounds travel across the warm night air. A man named Solomon, who had worked the fields for 20 years and who had lost his wife to a sale the previous spring, sat on the step of his cabin and listened without moving. The stable hand, a young man called August, saw Josephine moving along the tree line in the moonlight and looked away. The two women who helped in the kitchen, Matilda and Rose, heard the silver bell ring from the dining room with frantic insistence. They looked at one another across the soapy dishwater. They finished washing the pot they were washing. What would you have done, standing at the edge of that sound, knowing everything you knew and nothing you were permitted to say out loud? By midnight the Beaumont great house had gone silent as a church between services. Josephine was 6 miles south, moving along a creek bed she had memorized during years of gathering herbs for the kitchen. Every full moon she had studied this path, using the excuse of wild thyme and bay laurel to walk further from the house than her labor required. She carried with her a cloth bundle containing a change of clothing, $42 accumulated coin by coin over years of small domestic thefts that felt, to her, like wages long overdue. She carried forged papers naming her as a free woman called Marie Fontenette, a seamstress from St. James Parish, traveling to visit a sick relative in Baton Rouge. The papers had been prepared over 6 months by a man named a free black boatman who moved along the bayou network with the invisibility that only genuine freedom can manufacture. Josephine had paid for those papers with money and with silence, protecting information about Cyprien's other activities that the plantation's overseer would have paid considerably to know. The discovery came at dawn. A field hand dispatched to the house for the morning's work orders found the front door standing open and the dining room a ruin of overturned furniture and human suffering. He ran back to the quarters without touching anything, and within the hour the enslaved community had gathered in the space between the cabins for a conversation held entirely in whispers and glances. It was Solomon who took charge, his voice steady with the authority of a man who has decided that fear costs more than courage. They agreed on a version of events before the first outsider arrived. The family had taken ill at dinner. The cause was unclear. The cook, Josephine, had been transferred to the Marshing estate near Lafayette some 3 weeks prior. They had all been present when the overseer drove her away in the wagon. They were certain of the date. If pressed, they would recall small corroborating details. The color of the dress she wore that morning, the fact that she had said goodbye to nobody in particular. From the records of the Lafourche Parish Sheriff's Office, June 14, 1859. Complaint received regarding suspicious deaths at the Beaumont estate. Investigating officer dispatched. Staff report cook transferred to Marching property, Lafayette, on or about May 22nd. Bill of sale to be verified. The bill of sale was Matilda's creation, and it was extraordinary. She had learned to read from Josephine herself, in the kitchen after midnight, tracing letters onto a flour-dusted board with a fingertip, whispering sounds into the dark as if language were contraband, which in Louisiana, in 1859, it was. The document bore a credible signature, a plausible buyer's name, and ink that had been aged with tobacco water and left to dry near the hearth. When Sheriff Prosper Fontenot arrived at the estate with his deputy and the parish coroner, a man named Dr. Remy Casey, he found a household operating with the careful precision of people managing grief. Solomon met them at the door with his hat in both hands, his expression arranged into the particular combination of deference and distress that 13 years of survival had taught him to produce on command. He answered questions in the slow, measured way of someone choosing each word carefully, not from deception, but from the ingrained habit of caution that never fully leaves a person who has spent their life being misread. Dr. Castex moved through the house with scientific thoroughness. He noted the presentation of each body. He collected samples. He returned to the dining room 3 times, standing very still in the center of the room, looking at the arrangement of the table, as if it might tell him something the bodies had not. His preliminary findings matched Josephine's calculations exactly. He noted the specific progression of symptoms and the particular distribution of the poison across multiple dishes, the lamb, the sauce, the bread, even the wine. This, he told the sheriff quietly, was not accident or contamination. The amount required, and the method of delivery, indicated deliberate preparation by someone with precise knowledge of both chemistry and kitchen access. Who prepared this meal? The sheriff asked, though he already understood the answer. We all contributed, Solomon replied, which was technically true and carefully chosen. Josephine prepared the sauces before she left us, but the final meal was finished by many hands. If something is wrong with the food, then many hands touched it. The sheriff studied the room one more time. Outside, through the window, he could see the cane fields standing in their long green rows, indifferent to what had happened in the house at their edge. He asked for the transfer papers for the cook Josephine. Solomon produced Matilda's forgery without hesitation. What Dr. Castex noticed, because he was a man of specific attention, was a detail the sheriff overlooked entirely. In the kitchen pantry, behind the flour barrel, he found a hollow gourd that had been recently disturbed. The gourd was empty, but its interior carried the faint residue of white powder. He said nothing about this to the sheriff. He wrote it in his private notes and closed his bag. Josephine, traveling now as Marie Fontenette, reached Baton Rouge on the morning of the third day, carried on Cyprien's flat-bottomed boat through bayou channels that appeared on no official map. She sat among crates of river catfish, her forged papers tucked inside her blouse, her face neutral as still water. She was 34 years old and had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch in 4 days, but her hands were steady. She had made sure of that. The newspapers reached Baton Rouge before she did. From the New Orleans Daily Crescent, June 15, 1859. Entire planter family perished in Thibodeau poisoning. 11 souls dead following birthday celebration at prominent Lafourche Parish estate. Enslaved cook believed responsible. Substantial reward offered. 11, not 12, she noted, reading this over a stranger's shoulder at the Baton Rouge waterfront. She had given the youngest grandchild, Henry, something different. A measured dose designed to mimic illness and produce unconsciousness but not death. She had done this quietly, invisibly, spooning his broth from a separate pot before anyone noticed. The child had reminded her of nothing except the fact that he was 7 years old, and had not yet chosen to be what his grandfather was. She had carried that decision for 4 months before making it, and she had made it alone, and she had not once second-guessed it. The investigation in Lafourche Parish grew more dangerous by the day. Sheriff Fontenette was a methodical man, not brilliant but persistent, the kind of official who lacks imagination but compensates with thoroughness. He sent inquiries to Lafayette and received confirmation, too quickly and too smoothly, that no Marching estate existed at the address provided in Matilda's bill of sale. He returned to the Beaumont property with a harder expression and a deputy on each side. Solomon had anticipated this. He had prepared a secondary layer of the story during the 4 days since the sheriff's first visit, consulting quietly with the others in the quarters during the brief hours when the estate's temporary overseer, a rough man named Droot, who had been hired by the estate's lawyers, was occupied elsewhere. Solomon told the sheriff that Josephine had spoken of a cousin in the Feliciana parishes who could arrange work, that she had been distracted and volatile since her children were separated from her years ago, that she had perhaps misled them all about where she was actually going. He allowed his eyes to carry genuine moisture, because he was not in fact lying about Josephine's grief, which had been real and total and had never once disappeared. The sheriff looked at each face in turn. These were people who had survived by becoming impossible to read, whose inner lives were so thoroughly concealed that the men who owned them had long since given up, believing they had any. He found nothing to grip. Dr. Castex was conducting his own parallel investigation, less official and more troubling. He had found, in the ruins of a fire pit behind the quarters, fragments of paper with letters burned but not entirely destroyed. He recognized the letter forms as consistent with someone trained in a specific style of penmanship, careful and small. He said nothing to the sheriff about this either. He was a man of science in a place that preferred its science not to ask certain questions, and he was beginning to feel the weight of what he was beginning to understand. From the private journal of Dr. Remick, June 19, 1859. The cook was not what they think she was. The cook was what happens when you spend a decade feeding people who refuse to see you as a person. I find myself reluctant to write what I suspect, because suspicion in writing becomes evidence, and evidence in this parish becomes a noose around whatever neck is nearest. Josephine moved north through the network with the methodical efficiency of someone following a route memorized long in advance. A free black minister in Baton Rouge who asked no questions, a Creole shopkeeper in Natchitoches who fed her and sent her on with a name and an address, a white Quaker woman in Arkansas who opened her door before Josephine knocked and said, "Only, we have been expecting someone, come in and eat." The reward offered by the Beaumont estate's surviving relatives, a collection of cousins and in-laws who materialized from across 3 states, like flies drawn to a wound. reached $1,000 by the end of June and $1,500 by July. Slave catchers worked the routes north with dogs, trained on clothing taken from the fire pit behind the quarters. But Rose had spent the night of the murders, rubbing pepper and turpentine into every fabric she could locate in Josephine's space, and the dogs reported nothing coherent. The community at the Beaumont estate held for 3 weeks. Then Droot, the temporary overseer, discovered that Matilda could read. He found her with a Bible in her hands on a Sunday afternoon, her lips moving. He did not hit her immediately. He was, in his particular cruelty, more patient than that. He separated her from her rations for 2 days, then from her sleeping space, then questioned her in the presence of 2 other enslaved workers, with the careful theater of a man who wanted an audience for the breaking. Matilda gave him the teaching. She told him that Josephine had run a school under the large cypress tree at the western edge of the property, that she had taught letters using Bible pages and charcoal, that she had done this for years before the murders. This was true, and it was also useless to the investigation, because the cypress tree was bare, the ashes were in the vegetable garden, and the people who had been taught refused entirely to demonstrate their knowledge. But the sheriff connected something from this information that changed the geography of his search. A literate, enslaved woman who could forge documents was not running without direction. She was following something. He requested records from the estate's purchase histories and found, in the colonel's personal effects, a transaction log from 1848. Josephine and 2 male children had been purchased together from a sale in Nashville. The children had been resold immediately. One had gone to a property in the hill country near Jackson, the other to a family named Arsenault near Opelousas. He wrote a report that night by lamplight, his boots still muddy from the estate grounds. The woman is not running away from something. She is running toward something. Find the children, and we find the mother. Josephine did not know the sheriff had found this thread. She was in Missouri by then, in the household of a free black family named Garrett, who gave her a room the size of a closet and work mending clothes, and the first 2 consecutive nights of sleep she had experienced since the murders. She sat in that small room with a piece of paper in her lap and a stub of pencil in her hand, writing a letter to a school in Ontario, Canada, that she had been told by a conductor on the underground network might have information about 2 young men, formerly enslaved, now teachers of freed people's children. The letter bore her handwriting, distinctive in a way she had never considered a liability until Dr. Castex had begun comparing documents. She formed the letter J with a particular downstroke, a small curving pressure at the base, that appeared on kitchen inventories, on prayers copied from scripture, and on both the forged bill of sale and the poison records she had kept in a coded journal hidden beneath her sleeping mat, a journal that Droot had discovered and that was currently sitting on Sheriff Fontenette's desk. The letter was intercepted. At the postal office in St. Louis, a clerk there had received the circular with her description and handwriting sample. He compared the J's carefully. He sent a telegraph south. The knock came at 3 in the morning, sharp and without apology. Josephine woke before the sound finished, her hand reaching for the small vial she kept always within reach. The last dose, the final argument she had prepared against capture. She heard boots on the stairs, more than 2 pairs, and she moved with the silence of someone who has spent years making herself inaudible, in houses that were not her own. She went toward the back door, and found it already watched. She went toward the kitchen, and considered the window. She heard the front door opening below, voices official and flat, a language she recognized as the sound of the law confirming for itself what it already intended to do. She did something they did not expect. She wrapped a different cloth around her head, took a basin from the kitchen shelf, filled it with water from the pitcher on the stove, and walked directly into the hallway where the deputy U.S. Marshal was turning toward the stairs. She collided with him. The water went across his coat. She made herself small and old, her spine curving, her voice climbing into a register she had not used since childhood, full of breathless apology and the practiced diminishment of someone accustomed to occupying as little space as possible. She was just a washwoman, she explained. She came early for the linens. She kept the scarred hand hidden under the wet cloth and extended the unmarked one with a trembling she did not have to manufacture, because her heart was beating at a frequency she could feel in her teeth. The marshal looked at her the way men with legal authority look at black women they have decided are beneath their notice. The man behind him, a professional tracker named Beausoleil, who had been hired privately by the Beaumont heirs and who had followed her handwriting from Thibodaux to St. Louis with the terrifying patience of someone paid per capture rather than per day, stopped. He looked at her hands. "Show me both of them," he said. The moment lasted as long as a held breath. Upstairs someone shouted that they'd found the room. The door of the second-floor bedroom slammed open hard enough to crack the frame. In the half-second of noise and distraction, Josephine threw the remaining water in Beausoleil's face and ran. She hit the front door with her shoulder and came out onto the street in the pre-dawn gray of a Missouri morning. The cobblestones slick with overnight rain, the sky the color of an old bruise at the edges where the sun was not yet ready to commit to the day. She ran east, then south, then east again, through the smell of horses and coal smoke and river mud, until she reached the waterfront, where the Missouri River moved with its characteristic lack of concern for human urgency. Beausoleil was behind her. She could hear him, his footsteps, efficient and unhurried, in the way of a man who understood that a woman running out of options was already caught. The river was high with June rains, brown and fast and cold, even in summer. She turned at the edge of the dock and faced the men spreading out behind her in a semicircle, the way she had once seen dogs surround a rabbit in the cane fields, and the rabbit had sat very still before the end. "Josephine was not a rabbit. You are a murderer," the marshal said, his voice arranged in the official register of justice. 11 people, a family. She laughed, and it surprised her, the quality of it, because it sounded like something breaking open rather than something being broken. "You want to speak to me of families," she said. Her voice did not shake. "You who separated children from their mothers and entered it in a ledger like a business transaction. You want to discuss what I owe the dead." On the dock around her, men who had been loading freight at that early hour had stopped. A handful of free black dock workers, 2 Irish laborers, a woman in a grey dress with a market basket on her arm. They stood and watched and did not look away. Dr. Castex had arrived on the overnight steamboat from New Orleans. He had traveled on his own resources and his own conscience, carrying Josephine's journal in his medical bag and a weight he had been moving around in his chest for 3 weeks. He pushed through the crowd until he could see her face. He had spent 40 days reading her words, her calculations, her grief, and he had arrived at something that was not forgiveness and was not condemnation and had no name he knew. "Your sons," he said, loudly enough to be heard above the river. "Josephine, your sons are alive. I found them." She went still. He continued quickly, because he was a man who understood the value of precision. The one sold to the hill country near Jackson was purchased 2 years later by a Quaker abolitionist named Broussard, who paid for his freedom and sent him to Ohio. He teaches school in Cleveland. The one near Opelousas was taken north by freed people during a cholera outbreak when the family who owned him died. He is in Toronto. He goes by the name Joseph. He has your eyes and your handwriting. The vial was in her hand. The tracker Beausoleil was close enough to see her knuckles. "They are free," Castex said. "They have been free for years. They became free because you survived long enough to give them that. If you had died in that house in 1848, there would have been no one to remember their names." The crowd was very quiet. The river was not. Josephine stood at the edge of the dock and looked across the water toward the north, where the sky was beginning to pale into something that could almost be called morning. She thought of 2 boys' faces. She thought of the weight of 11 deaths, and what they had cost, and what they had bought. She thought of the choice she had made about the child Henry, the one who had tasted something wrong at dinner and been given something different in his soup, the one who was alive somewhere in Louisiana because she had decided, months before the night itself, that innocence deserved the room her captors had never given her. She thought of all the other choices still available to her. The marshal moved forward. She turned and stepped off the dock. The Missouri River received her without ceremony and moved on. They searched for 4 days. They dragged nets through the brown water and interviewed fishermen and watched the banks downstream for what rivers sometimes return. They found nothing that was Josephine. The search was eventually ruled complete by the absence of further evidence, and a missing persons declaration was filed with the federal marshal's office, noting that the suspect had drowned while fleeing. Lawful arrest. From the personal notes of Dr. Remy K. July 9, 1859, the river police insist no one could survive that current in those clothes at that speed. They have clearly never met a woman who taught herself poison chemistry while pretending to dust furniture. He remained in St. Louis for 2 weeks after the official search concluded. He interviewed the residents of the Garrett household individually, each of whom had developed comprehensive amnesia regarding any woman matching Josephine's description. He visited the postal office where her letter had been intercepted and asked to see the original. The J at the bottom of the page was hers, unmistakable, but what caught his attention was what it said. She had not simply been writing to locate her sons, she had been writing to tell them she was coming. 8 days after the drowning was declared, a farmer named Christophe reported a missing rowboat from his property 40 miles downstream. His wife mentioned a figure moving along the riverbank at first light, favoring one side, moving with the particular careful deliberateness of someone managing old pain. Castex had read enough of Josephine's journal to know she had broken her right collarbone in childhood during a fall, that it had healed improperly, that in cold and damp weather she moved with a slight protective lean to the left. He filed this observation in the same private place he filed everything else he knew about her, and told no one. Back in Thibodeau, the Beaumont estate was sold at auction before the summer ended. The 41 enslaved people who remained were dispersed to 7 different buyers with the administrative efficiency of an estate clearing inventory. Solomon was sent to a rice operation in South Carolina. Matilda went to a property in Mississippi where she continued teaching letters in secret using methods she had learned under a cypress tree in Louisiana. The community that had held together through 3 weeks of investigation was dismantled by geography, separated as completely as if they had been the words of a book torn apart and distributed to different libraries, each fragment coherent alone but the whole story now impossible to assemble bossily. The tracker spent another month following the river north. He found one more trace, a woman described as a laundress working at a boarding house for freed people in Illinois, her left hand always gloved despite the summer heat. He arrived 2 days after she had moved on. The boarding house owner, a large woman named Mrs. Arsino, who had been born free and had never once in her life allowed a slave catcher to search her premises without making him feel the full measure of her contempt, told him she had never seen anyone matching that description, and suggested he try the river. He left empty-handed and, 4 weeks later, took a different case. In the autumn of 1859, stories began circulating in the freed people's communities along the Illinois waterways. A woman, always alone, moving north before winter, money left anonymously for families sheltering runaways, always in exact amounts, $42, the precise sum of accumulated coins from 11 years of small domestic resistances. A letter received by abolitionists in Chicago, written in that particular hand. An unnamed benefactor who donated funds for a school for black children in Cleveland. The donation accompanied by a note that said only, "Knowledge is the only thing they cannot auction." Dr. Castex filed his final official report on December 3, 1859. Josephine, enslaved cook, presumed deceased by drowning. July 1859. Investigation closed. Case resolved. He locked her journal in the bottom drawer of his medical cabinet and returned to his practice in New Orleans, where he treated plantation families and freed people with equal clinical attention and told neither group what he knew about the other. He kept the journal for 30 years. When he died in 1891, his daughter found it among his effects, along with a sealed letter marked to be read only after my death. The letter contained a confession. A body had been found downstream 3 weeks after the official search. An elderly black woman who had drowned in a separate incident. Castex had examined the body and confirmed officially that it was Josephine's. The hands bore no scarring. The age was wrong by at least 15 years. The identification was a lie he had constructed with the quiet efficiency of a man who had decided that some forms of justice exist in the spaces that official records cannot reach. His daughter read this letter twice, then burned it carefully in the kitchen stove, and went on with her day. In Chicago in the winter of 1865, a woman named Adelaide Fontenot opened a boarding house on the south side of the city in the neighborhood. That was becoming the center of the black community arriving from the lower states. She was perhaps 40, perhaps older, her exact age unclear even to those who knew her best. She cooked with a skill that other cooks came to observe and study, and she ran her establishment with the organized intelligence of someone who had spent years managing complex operations under conditions of significant pressure. She wore gloves in all seasons. She taught the young women who worked for her things that were not, strictly speaking, part of their domestic duties: how to read contracts, how to recognize the language of documents that worked against the people signing them, how to move through a city that did not entirely want them in it. She received 2 visitors in the spring of 1868, 2 men, 130 and 128, who traveled from Cleveland and Toronto respectively to find an Adelaide Fontenot whose address had been sent to them anonymously through a network they had been part of without fully understanding why. The younger one had her eyes. The older one carried himself with the same quality of contained stillness that Adelaide wore like weather. They sat in her parlor for 3 hours and spoke carefully around what they all understood. The way you walk around a piece of furniture in the dark, knowing where it is without touching it. We know what happened, the elder said, his voice carrying the Ohio flatness of a man who had grown up in a cold climate. We found newspaper accounts, court records. She waited. We understand why, the younger one said. His voice was softer, carrying a different geography. We know what they took from you. Adelaide Fontenot looked at her sons for a long moment without speaking. Then she said, I tried to leave you something worth being alive for. They came once. They did not come again, but they wrote. The letters were formal and careful and signed your sons in freedom, and she kept them in a locked box under the false bottom of the bedroom wardrobe, alongside $42 in old coins and a small glass vial that was empty and had been empty for years, but which she kept away. You keep the shell of something that protected you once. Out of respect for what it was, Adelaide Fontenot continued operating the boarding house through the end of the war and into the years after, when the city was remade by fire and rebuilt by people arriving from everywhere with their histories wrapped around them. She taught and fed and sheltered and passed along the knowledge that had cost her everything. Specific knowledge about chemistry, about documents, about how to read the expressions of people who have decided your life is less consequential than their convenience. She trained a generation of young women who went on to work in the households and institutions of Chicago's emerging black middle class, carrying with them a particular quality of watchfulness and competence that their employers sometimes remarked upon without understanding its origin. In the winter of 1884, a young woman arrived at the boarding house seeking work. Her name was Josephine, and she explained that her grandmother had given her that name in memory of someone the grandmother admired, a woman who had chosen freedom over everything and had paid for that choice in ways that could not be fully counted. She was 22 and she wanted to study medicine, which no institution in Illinois would permit a black woman to do formally, and so she intended to learn it however she could. Adelaide hired her the same afternoon. She taught the young woman everything, cooking and chemistry, and the difference between a dose that heals and a dose that harms, and the terrible closeness of those two things. She taught her how to read the literature that circulated in abolitionist communities, political philosophy, medical texts, legal arguments. She taught her the particular skill of learning from people who have no idea they are teaching you. How to be present in a room in a way that makes you invisible to the powerful and visible to those who need you. Why give me all of this? The young woman asked one evening, after a lesson in herbal properties that had moved well past anything a cook required. Because I wasted years being invisible to survive. Adelaide replied, I want you to be invisible only when you choose. Adelaide Fontenot died in the spring of 1885. She was found in the morning in her room, arranged with a neatness that spoke of forethought. The small glass vial on the table beside her, now containing nothing. The death certificate listed heart failure. Josephine, who had been trained in enough medicine to know what she was reading, looked at the document and said nothing to anyone, and filed it carefully in the boarding house records. A stranger appeared at the funeral, an old white woman from Louisiana, very finely dressed in the manner of someone from another era, her face hidden by a black veil that she did not lift. She set a single stem of magnolia, improbably fresh, on the coffin before the service, and left without speaking to anyone. Later, through considerable effort, Josephine traced the woman to a family in Thebes. She was 76 years old. Her name was Henry Beaumont, who had grown up to be a woman of considerable reserve and complicated conscience. He had been 7 at the dinner table in 1859. He had tasted something wrong in his soup, had felt himself slipping into a darkness that lasted until the following morning, and had woken to find himself in a wagon driven by a stranger who told him nothing for 3 days. He had been raised by a Quaker family in Tennessee and had spent 68 years understanding what he owed to the woman who had decided that he, alone at that table, had not yet earned his inheritance of guilt. The boarding house on the south side of Chicago continued operating until 1901, run by Josephine and then by her students after her. It was known in the community as a place where good food was served alongside lessons that appeared on no official curriculum, where young women learned to read documents and understand contracts, and move through a world arranged against them with the specific competence of people who have done the work of thinking clearly about what they face. Its reputation survived in the stories passed between women who had been there, specific stories about a particular quality of instruction, a particular set of skills taught in a kitchen that smelled of onions and bay laurel, and something harder to name. During the demolition of the building in 1922, workers found a tin box inside the wall of what had been the kitchen, sealed with wax and wrapped in oilcloth. Inside was a journal written in small, careful letters with a distinctive J, formed at the base with a curving pressure that nobody present recognized. The final entry was undated. It read, "My sons know my name. My granddaughter carries it forward. What I did cannot be forgiven, and I have never asked for forgiveness, only for this, that the people I loved should live in a world where they own their own mornings." The journal was catalogued in an estate inventory, and then lost in the shuffling of papers that attended the redevelopment of that neighborhood, which was itself shuffled and redistributed and rebuilt more than once in the century that followed. But the stories stayed. Stories are more persistent than documents. They move through kitchens and churches and the spaces between what is recorded and what is true, seasoned with the specific knowledge that some costs are only visible to the people who paid them, and some freedom is only understood by those who earned it the hardest possible way.